Okay, I think we'll get started. Want to welcome everybody to today's event, which is called Steinbeck and the Environment. My name is Bruce Kane, and as I think many of you in the audience know, I'm director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. This event is the third and final for the year ArtsWest program. The previous ones that you may know, we did one event on Jack London in the fall, and then most recently we had Alex Nemiroff commenting on or talking about his book on Diane Arbus. And this is our third event. We go back to literature today and talk about Steinbeck. This initiative is one that we hope to continue next year, and we're already in a discussion about what we will do in the upcoming year. But the basic idea is to do things about culture, literature, the arts of the West. We do quite a bit, as many of you know, on policy and the intersection between governance and the environment, but we felt that it would be useful and valuable for us to have initiatives in broader areas, and so we brought in the ArtsWest program, and I think it's been very successful. We certainly have enjoyed the programs to date. Before we get started, I want to recognize a couple colleagues who've been very valuable to us, both for the ArtsWest program generally and also in composing today's program. First, Mark Levin, my former colleague at Berkeley, who actually came up with the idea of doing this and provided some funding along with his husband, and we really appreciate that. And Gavin Jones, who was not only the initiator of this program, but actually was involved in the putting together what has become a very successful course on the American West. And Gavin taught in the first year and was part of the faculty college team that put that course together. So Gavin is a valued colleague of ours at the Lane Center for the American West. I also want to thank the other co-hosts and sponsors, Stanford University Libraries, the American Studies program, and I see Shelley Fishkin is, is here. And also I want to thank Mandy McCullough, who volunteered her time and has done such a wonderful job in helping us. We have so many programs and so few staff that we were really desperate on this particular event, and Mandy stepped up, and we really appreciate it. We'll be very grateful to her for this organizing that she's done for this event. Now, following the event, there will be a reception and a special pop-up exhibit of rare books and manuscripts from special collections that explore Steinbeck's writing career and his friendship with marine biologist Edward Ricketts. So because we have such a full program, we're just going to go in the order of the program, and we're going to skip long bios because you have all the bios right here. And we're going to start with Val Lopez, who will speak to us about living Steinbeck. So Val.
Thank you very much. And I can tell you, in all honesty, that I'm very much out of my comfort zone here. I'm the tribal chairman of the Amah Mutsun tribal band, and our tribe is comprised of the indigenous peoples that were taken to Mission San Juan Bautista and Mission Santa Cruz. I also descend from the Rumsian tribe of the Monterey area, which are the peoples that were taken to Mission Carmel. So when we talk about the areas of Steinbeck, that's the heart of it. As a child, most of our tribal members worked in the farms and ranches of the greater Monterey area. Our tribe has been doing this type of work probably going back to the time of the missions in the late 1700s. In the early 1900s, our tribe established a working agreement with a number of farmers so that we knew on whose ranch we would be picking apricots, prunes, peaches, grapes, cotton, and more. On these ranches, it was usually just our tribe that we worked with. In early spring, we would travel to the sheep ranches and shear sheep. So our elders could shear sheep, so the men could shear sheep. Many of the ranches were in the Monterey and Santa Clara counties. We also traveled to ranches in Oregon and Nevada. What I noticed was that there was always people from New Zealand and Australia who were shearing sheep with us on these ranches. A few ranchers knew we descended from the missions, and they would say we could put our tents at their property whenever we needed a place to stay. During the rainy season, it was not unusual to see 13 to 15 tents lined up. When it got too wet, we could move to packing sheds and stay there. During my childhood, I can remember sitting behind the circle of men talking and listening to their stories. They would talk of our tribal history, our culture, our ties to the land, and how we needed to take care of the water and wildlife. And then after a number of beers, they would tell stories of their remembrances of places like Los Angeles and San Francisco. After a few more beers, they would talk of the war, of World War II and Korea. On occasion, they would talk about women, and when this happened, I was always told to leave. My father transitioned from farm labor to construction in the 50s. My mom and us children continued to work on the ranches. We rented a very small two-bedroom duplex in Morgan Hill that was across from the railroad tracks. Hobos riding the train regularly knocked on our door asking for food. My mom was always ready for them. She would keep the empty jars and lids from the groceries she bought, and when they came by, she would fill up a jar with beans and rice and hand it to them with a few tortillas. My dad explained to us that we needed to take care of each other. Growing up, I didn't know how to make friends, and trusting other people was very hard. In high school, I started reading and soon discovered John Steinbeck. I enjoyed Steinbeck because he wrote on topics I understood, and his reading style did not make me feel stupid, which was a big issue growing up. During my senior year, I read Grapes of Wrath with a lot of love and at the same time uncertainty. I was confused because Steinbeck wrote of farm workers that I had never seen. I was familiar with the term Okie, but I saw very few Okies doing farm work. The landlord of our duplex, who lived directly behind us, was an Okie. She proudly played her organ and sang religious songs all day long. I was also confused because Steinbeck wrote of farm work as a temporary way of life. And yet, for so many of our members, this was our life for well over 150 years. A few of the ranches we worked on had farm labor houses. I was always jealous of the tribal families that got to live in the houses. We always stayed in tents or the tray houses, the drying trays. One day I told a cousin how lucky he was to live in a house. He told me that there were so many rats in the house that he considered us the lucky ones. After my first read of Steinbeck, I can remember thinking that I loved that farm workers were being written about. But I wish that Steinbeck had written about our tribe and our struggles. I could easily identify to the poverty, suffering, and social justice issues. For our members, hunger was seldom an issue. For us, we knew many of the traditional food plants, and the men of our tribe always hunted. There was no season for hunting. Also, at the end of each summer, each family member would buy large sacks of beans, rice, and flour and carefully store them so they wouldn't get ruined. I didn't read East of Eden until my second year in college. During this time, I was giving a lot of thought to the traditional values of our tribe, including the importance of having an intimate relationship with Mother Nature, Mother Earth. I was also focused on how so many people seemed to value domination and exploitation purely for profit. I saw the Salinas Valley change into huge agricultural fields. These fields came at the expense of our indigenous foods, medicines, basketry, and many other types of plants. They were introducing pesticides, herbicides, and netting that would keep the birds out. I remember listening to a farmer who proudly showed seeds that had been covered with poison and that would kill any bird that ate it. As a youth, I had a job in the Salinas Valley that required us to pick up DDT, to scoop up DDT with coffee cans from a 55-barrel gallon barrel and pour it into a men's sock. We would then walk along and dust the plants with DDT. When we did this, we didn't wear gloves and we were without a dust mask. Probably what hurt most is that they did not see the spirituality of the land in East of Eden. For our tribe, the land, water, and wildlife are our ancestors. How could anyone remove poison or sal, our relatives? It seemed to me that the battle of good versus evil that was written about in East of Eden is continuing, and evil was winning. When we looked at the California landscape today, we were seeing a landscape almost anywhere, 99.5, 101, that is 96% non-native. When we look at our air and our water as our relatives, it brings great sadness. As just about everyone, I enjoyed reading the characters of Steinbeck. I was certain that I knew every one of them. When Steinbeck talked of Ed Ricketts, I was reminded of Professor Bob, who liked to hang at our house and drink beer with my dad and our tribal members. Professor Bob was actually a professor from San Jose State, and he hated his job. He loved hearing the old stories and contributed many of his own. What I remember most about Professor Bob was how there was a lot of pressure on him to get things published. After a long day of drinking and then having dinner, he decided that he would publish a book on Mexican food. He worked with a mom and other tribal members and women from other women from our tribe on the different recipes, and then he actually published the book. I remember how much we laughed when we learned that one of the recipes was on how to boil beans. Another interesting person from the past was our neighbor Ron. Ron was a chef at the Capri restaurant in Morgan Hill. The Capri was the only fancy restaurant in town. Whenever Ron was over, he always insisted on doing the cooking. It was Ron who introduced us to Italian, French, and other types of food. What we enjoyed most is that whenever we were going fishing, we would always let Ron know. When we got home from fishing, my dad would just give the gunny sack of fish to Ron, and then he'd clean them up and cook them. After a couple of hours, we were called to dinner and enjoyed the most delicious meal that we could never pronounce. People from many walks of life enjoyed laughing and hanging out with our tribe. Most people that were invited to our house were people that my dad met at the bar. I can remember that they talked about people from a bunch of ethnicities, and they always used the derogatory terms for them. They were all drunks, and I think these were the people that my dad trusted the most. Steinbeck raises a lot of moral issues that have existed from the beginning of time. I struggled and wrestled with these in high school and college, and in the years since, and we struggle with them today. I wanted to let you know that I read Steinbeck from a different perspective, and he greatly influenced my life. It may have been Steinbeck that made me decide to go to college and major in English. He remains my favorite author to this day. Thank you.
That was great. I was interested in that story about DDT because I wrote a book about Rachel Carson, who, of course, wrote about DDT in Silent Spring. That was the book that kind of brought the end of DDT in this country. But I read a lot of stories like that about people handling pesticides with little regard for their own safety. Thank you all for coming out. I thought that I would try to put a little bit of context around John Steinbeck and the environment. And you start with these dates, which were, believe it or not, kind of decisive for me in deciding to write a book about John Steinbeck. So Steinbeck's born in 1902. This is just after the close of the Victorian era. People are riding horses. The Wright brothers haven't taken off at Kitty Hawk yet. And Steinbeck dies in 1968, just a few months before Neil Armstrong steps onto the moon. When you think about that span of time, It's really quite remarkable. And it's a period that we often refer to, or that has been referred to, as the American century. This is the time when America went from being kind of an adolescent frontier, second-rate country to being the preeminent superpower in the world. Economic, political, military preeminence really took place during the time that Steinbeck lived. And of course, his life paralleled all of that history. The other thing that was happening at that time was that there was a great explosion in technology and in the sciences, including in the life sciences. So in biology, and in a field that really emerged after the turn of the century called ecology, there were great advancements happening, and those all impinged eventually on Steinbeck. You don't have to read this whole thing. This is a quote from Ernst Haeckel, a famous German biologist who invented a lot of the terminologies and concepts that underlie modern biology. Have any of you ever heard the phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny? Is that familiar to anybody? No, well then it doesn't matter, but he coined that phrase. It's the idea that developing organisms go through, they sort of repeat their evolutionary history in utero, kind of progress from stage to stage. It turned out to not be true, but it kind of is. There's a certain aspect of that is true. But Haeckel invented, or certainly was one of the very earliest to use the term ecology, to talk about, as he says here, the study of all those complex interrelations referred to by Darwin as the conditions of the struggle for existence. So ecology was a recognition that all living things are related to each other and to the ecosystem, to the environment that they live in. By the middle part of the century, this idea was being popularized, and some writers that had big audiences were starting to talk about ecology and conservation, an idea that had been around for a while, sort of in the same context. And one of them was Rachel Carson, who I mentioned earlier. Before she started writing books about the ocean and eventually about DDT, she worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as an information specialist. And in the mid-1940s, she was assigned to write a series of pamphlets about the new National Wildlife Refuge System. These were mostly resting areas for waterfowl that were being set aside. And the Fish and Wildlife Service wanted people to understand why they were being set aside and what the rationale was and what the conservation issues were. And Carson, who, as she always did when she worked for the government and later on when she was an independent writer, took this idea and made it a lot more sophisticated than it had been. She was always doing work that her boss thought was too good for the government. So this series of pamphlets, they're about 20, 30 pages long. It's the kind of thing you would get at the kiosk at the entry to the Environmental Learning Center at the refuge. But in fact, they're literature, and if you ever get it, they're online. If you ever get a chance, take a look at them. They're really, really wonderful. They're beautifully, beautifully written. Each one was devoted to a specific one of these wildlife refuges, except for this one. This was Conservation in Action number 5, and that was a more general treatise on conservation, and it incorporated a lot of these ideas about ecology that had been kind of bubbling up over the preceding decades. It's kind of a serial tragedy in which she recounted these episodes where species and resources that we once considered to be so abundant that they could never disappear were under serious assault, and that we had learned that in fact species can go extinct and that wildlife can be dramatically diminished. And so she wrote about that in this one. And again, here, towards the end, this is from Conservation in Action number 5. She says, wildlife, water, forests, grasslands, all are part of man's essential environment. The conservation and effective use of one is impossible except as the others are also conserved. This is a real fundamental principle of ecology, which is that you can't impact one aspect of an ecosystem or environmental area and not have some collateral effect somewhere else in it. Things don't live in isolation, and so it's this interconnectedness that is important. Another writer working at exactly the same time as Carson was Aldo Leopold. Leopold was a professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and he had this place he called the Shack near Baraboo on the Wisconsin River. It was actually a converted chicken coop. And he's seen here sitting outside the shack. And he kept a journal of the seasons and the things that happened at the shack when he lived there. And he eventually started combining these into a book that also included some more philosophical essays about conservation and about the environment. And famously, it was in this manuscript that he put forward what he called a principle he called the land ethic. This is what Leopold is probably most famous for, and simply stated, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. This was a reversal of the idea that people had for a long time, which is that if you wanted to say preserve deer or trout, that what you should do is get rid of things like birds that fed on trout, or wolves or mountain lions that fed on deer. This idea that you could manipulate the environment to perpetuate the things you wanted. By the middle of the century, Leopold and Carson and others realized that everything was connected, and it really wasn't that simple. Leopold sent the manuscript for this book off to his publisher, Oxford University Press, and the title was Great Possessions. And it was being edited when he went one weekend up to the shack, and his neighbor's grassland caught on fire, and Leopold went next door to help fight the fire. And he had a heart attack and keeled over and died. And nobody noticed that he had collapsed, and the fire actually gently burned over his body where he had collapsed in the field. And as he always did, he had a little notebook in his pocket. And a friend of mine, and it's in the archives at the University of Wisconsin, and a friend of mine that looked at it a couple of years ago told me it still smells a little bit like smoke. But so Leopold died before Great Possessions was published, but it was published after he died, and Oxford worked with his heirs, and they said they loved the book, they didn't need to change anything except the title. They didn't like the title. And so the Leopold family said, well, what do you want to call it? And they said, well, we'd like to call it a Sand County Almanac, which you may have heard of. It's one of the pillars of environmentalism, a book that still sells extremely well today. Well, all of this sort of popularization of ecology and the environment flowed out of a lot of serious scientific work, much of which was done by this guy, or at least put together by this guy, Warder Clyde Lee. He was a professor at the University of Chicago, and he did a lot of research also at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And in 1931, he published this book, Animal Aggregations, again, a watershed event in the history of ecology. It's actually a compendium of several dozen scientific papers, most of which dealt with the effects of crowding on organisms. When living things are sort of crowded together in close proximity, interesting things happen. You'd think they'd all be negative, but they're not. There's actually a lot of beneficial effects that result from crowding. And W.C.L. had discovered that and or helped to discover it and included it in this book. This is from Animal Aggregations. This is really interesting. This is real fundamental ecology. Animals especially sustain multiple relations with the organisms of their environment. Communal life, therefore, is not an accidental fact. It's a normal, constant, universal fact. Again, one of the foundational concepts of ecology. Well, W.C.L. had a student when he was teaching at Chicago named Ed Ricketts. And Ricketts didn't finish school at Chicago, but he certainly took a lot of the ideas that he learned from L.E. when he moved to Pacific Grove and eventually opened a biological supply shop on Cannery Row. Ricketts would become the model for Doc in the book Cannery Row by John Steinbeck. And more significantly, he became very, very close friends with Steinbeck in the 1930s when they met in Pacific Grove. And they ultimately collaborated on a wonderful book of true ecology called The Sea of Cortez, which another one of our speakers is going to be telling you about today. But I got onto Ricketts because Rachel Carson's third book was a book about the intertidal zone on the Atlantic seaboard, and she modeled it consciously on Ed Ricketts' book, Between Pacific Tides, which had been published in 1939, and was another really important ecological work in that he, for the first time, looked at an ecosystem, not so much taxonomically, that is, he didn't look species by species. He looked at the type of seashore it was and the zone that it was in with respect to the tide and the surf, and then looked to see what kinds of things lived in those zones. And Carson used a similar principle in her book, The Edge of the Sea, which was published in 1955. So I got interested in Steinbeck through Rachel Carson and through Ed Ricketts. That's sort of the through line for me. And Steinbeck felt like a real natural fit to me because I'm interested in science and the environment and natural history and writers. So I look for people like that to write about. And I'm going to just say, kind of quickly, a broad overview of how the environment manifests itself in Steinbeck's work. It's kind of two categories, really. One, what he referred to once as the ecology of humans, which he thought had been sort of underappreciated in literature. And that probably meant a number of things. He had these ideas early on, even before he met people like Ed Ricketts and Joseph Campbell and Richard Albee, people that really were part of this intellectual stew in Pacific Grove that was going on in the 1930s. That's certainly his thoughts on this subject expanded. But very early on in his career, he was interested in how human beings interact with each other. And he eventually called this, or this was an aspect of something he called Phalanx Theory. And the idea in the phalanx is that when people are grouped together, they form a sort of superorganism that's like many individuals, form a larger super individual that has its own consciousness, its own history, its own instincts, its own volition. The collective is more than just being the whole, being more than the sum of the parts. The whole is actually becomes an entity unto itself. And this is a theme that recurs quite often in Steinbeck. It's a little bit analogous to this. If you think of the group as being made up of individuals, it's sort of equivalent to the idea that your body is made up of individual cells. Each cell is alive and a thing unto itself, but in the body there are all these emergent properties that make for a human being that is much more complicated and has many more aspects than the cell. It shows, and again, the phalanx, the ecology of humans, is a theme that recurs many, many places in Steinbeck, whether it's a workers' union or a group of migrants, or even just a family like the Joad family making its way across the country. I'm going to just read a little short thing here from The Pearl. The Pearl is the story of a young Mexican fisherman who finds a large pearl that he expects will change his life, and it does, ends up doing that in many unexpected ways. One of the things that happens to Kino, the fisherman, is that as soon as he discovers this pearl, it's news everywhere in the town he lives, even without any effort on his part to tell people about it. And this is an example of the phalanx, the town. A town is a thing like a colonial animal. A town has a nervous system and a head and shoulders and feet. A town is a thing separate from all other towns, so that there are no two towns alike. And a town has a whole emotion. How news travels through a town is a mystery not easily to be solved. News seems to move faster than small boys can scramble and dart to tell it, faster than women can call it over the fences. Before Kino and Juana and the other fishers had come to Kino's brush house, the nerves of the town were pulsing and vibrating with the news. Kino had found the pearl of the world. So the town, again, is an individual, a kind of superorganism unto itself. That first sentence is great. A town is a thing like a colonial animal. Colonial animals are complicated entities that are made up of many similar, coral would be a good example of a colonial animal. So an individual coral joins with many other individual corals to make a coral head. And if you wanted to extend it beyond that, you could look at the reef as a kind of even larger group that forms out of the corals. The other way that the environment sort of appears in Steinbeck's work, and this is probably the more interesting to me, is in this acute sense of place he has. Now, all writers try to, fix their stories in terms of location, and to write about the places where the action unfolds. For Steinbeck, this was extremely important, and one of the interesting features about it is how often it was the same place in Steinbeck. Steinbeck was born in Salinas, in the Salinas Valley, and he never let that image go away. He held on to it for his whole life, and it recurs in his work again and again and again. You see valleys. Sometimes it is literally the Salinas Valley. Other times it's different California valleys that are somewhat like it. And the valley is a place in Steinbeck that is, it's interesting. It can be a place of safety, of solace. It can be a fertile place, a productive place. But it's always balanced on this knife's edge between dry times and wet times. And so the valley can be transformed from lush to barren and from barren to lush depending on the availability of the rain. And this is important to Steinbeck because he was alert to the conditions of this environment that his characters had to endure. Valley shows up over and over again. The Salinas Valley literally in East of Eden and in the story of the chrysanthemums, but you see valleys in To a God Unknown and in many other works. It is a recurrent theme. It is Steinbeck grounded in the place he was from. And of course, in his greatest work, The Grapes of Wrath, the Joad family starts out on the plains of Oklahoma, but they head for a valley, the Central Valley of California, and they leave behind a drought, the harshest imaginable kind of conditions, or at least the harshest imaginable until in the end they arrive in California, and at the end of the book we've moved from drought to flood, and the Joads are being, the Joads are left in the lurch at the end of The Grapes of Wrath. I'm going to close with I'm just going to read a little bit about the valley because I think it is so, if I can find it. This is just a little excerpt about Steinbeck's Valley. In the California winter, after the sun is down and the land has gone dark, the night air descends from the mountains that flank the great Central Valley and settles over the fields and tules below. When conditions are right, the cold air forms a fog so dense that you cannot see your own feet on the ground. These fogs can last for days and sometimes fill the 450-mile length of the valley. To the west of the Gabilan Mountains in Monterey County, near the ocean, lies another smaller valley. Once it had been an arm of the sea. 90 miles long and shaped like a sword, it follows the course of the Salinas River as it runs northward toward Monterey Bay. The valley is flat between the Gabilans and the Santa Lucia Mountains that separate it from the Pacific. Here, a different fog comes in summer, when inland heating draws in a marine layer of cooler, moist air from the ocean. This seaborne fog does not lie quietly on the land, but seeps over the folded hillsides, rising and falling along the river bottom. When the fog comes and the mountains and the outside world disappear, it is like being in a dream. But the gray mood does not last. The light returns, the scene changes, the fogs lift. Day by day, the mountains turn from blue-black at dawn to pale gold under the sun in the endless sky, and the fertile earth of the valley floor is lined with rows of lettuce, some a mile long. So that's not Steinbeck, that's me. Those are the opening lines of my book about John Steinbeck, which tells you that when I think of Steinbeck, I think about the valley. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sarah Wald, and I want to start by thanking the Bill Lane Center for the American West and Gavin Jones and Mandy McCullough and Preeti Haymeyer and so many others whose labor made this event possible and allowed for me to join you today. It's really an honor to be able to speak on this panel of scholars and writers whose work I deeply admire and to discuss an author who's fascinated me for so long. I'm going to talk about The Grapes of Wrath, and the environmental issue that sort of brought me to The Grapes of Wrath was the alternative food movement and looking at critiques of industrial agriculture and the role of land and race and citizenship in that discussion. So I titled my talk today, We Ain't Foreign, which is from The Grapes of Wrath, and it references the white Dust Bowl migrants like the Joads. And I selected this phrase because it gets at the politics of belonging and citizenship that I see at the heart of Steinbeck's novel. So what I want to outline for you today is how race and citizenship depended on notions of land ownership of California during the Great Depression, and how John Steinbeck then navigated this discourse. My argument is that notions of race and citizenship are highly entangled with Steinbeck's notion of land and land ownership. That's not because Steinbeck invented such constructions, but because they were part of the common cultural sense of the period, a cultural common sense that he had to navigate in order for his work to be legible for a larger public. Representations of the Dust Bowl migration during the Great Depression challenged popular representations of the nation's march towards a better and brighter future. As displaced farmers turned into exploited farm workers, Dust Bowl migrants became a particularly important representation of the Great Depression. Their plight suggested the failure of America's rural fantasy, and they suggested the failure of Jeffersonian agrarianism. Jeffersonian agrarianism, you might recall, is that notion that the ideal citizen is the land-owning farmer. And according to Jeffersonian logic, farmers are self-sufficient, which leads to economic independence, and that economic independence leads to political independence, thus is important for democracy. But there's also a moral angle. So Jefferson's idea was also that farmers were the chosen people of God, and that farmers are particularly moral people, and thus sort of the moral guardians of the nation in a certain way. They're more moral than the rest of us. And Jeffersonian agrarianism has long been at the heart of our ideas about what it means to be a good American citizen, and I would argue in popular culture and social movements, it continues to perform that role today. Just look at ads for Chipotle or Dodge Ram, and you see the American farmer still being called out as sort of the moral center of the nation. Through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, California played a particular role in fulfilling our nation's Jeffersonian fantasies. Many boosters positioned it as America's Eden. According to our nation's frontier mythology, prosperity resulted from the availability of land. White settlers could find a place to farm, and with work they could build a successful life for themselves. California, with its bountiful fields, showed this greatness. Its abundance was seen as revealing God's blessing on U.S. expansion around the continent. So if that's what's going on in the popular imagination and the national conversation, what does it then mean to have all of these farmers failing in the middle of the country in terms of the public images that's circulating, and then being unable to get land and unable to become farm owners in California? People like John Steinbeck, Dorothea Lange, Paul Taylor, and Carrie McWilliams told the nation a really different story about California. Their books, articles, and photographs showed hard-working, displaced farmers pouring into California only to find themselves as expendable farm workers with no chance of owning land or even of feeding their children. The Dust Bowl migration, as a failure of America's rural fantasy, challenged a broader understanding of the relationship between white citizenship and land ownership. In the popular imagination, the Dust Bowl migration suggested a crisis in white land ownership. This crisis in white land ownership became a crisis in white identity and white citizenship. And Great Depression writers on both the left and the right responded to this crisis. Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath was one of many responses that navigated this crucial connection between whiteness, citizenship, and land ownership. In his novel, when white farmers lose their land and are forced to become farm workers, their whiteness becomes questioned by those around them. And if you've read the novel recently, you might recall a scene at a gas station where somebody compares the white Dust Bowl migrants to gorillas using a racialized language. Their whiteness is becoming they're losing it with their land in the text, not in their own self-conception, but in the perceptions of those around them. This threat to Dust Bowl migrants' whiteness is depicted in multiple texts from across the political spectrum. The ideological connection between land ownership and whiteness was so strong in this period that landless farm workers could become not quite white. They were in danger of losing their access to whiteness with their land, right? Sort of reinforcing an idea of whiteness as a kind of property and privilege. Authors and advocates responded to this crisis and white land ownership and white identities in pretty different ways based on where they were on the political spectrum, as you might imagine. Conservative authors and advocates, especially those affiliated with the Associated Farmers, tended to question the whiteness and the citizenship fitness of Dust Bowl migrants. This is a strategy we see happening in works like Hart Raff's The Grapes of Gladness and Ruth Comfort Mitchell's Of Human Kindness. In both of these works, the right kind of Dust Bowl migrants do gain land and establish their rights to the privileges of white citizenship. But those who are lazy or too easily swayed by devious communists are the ones who end up landless, impoverished, or to blame to their own misfortunes. In contrast to this approach, some authors on the left use the crisis in white land ownership to expand notions of citizenship and the rights to land ownerships to Black, Mexican, Japanese, and Filipino farmers and farm workers. They used outrage over the displacement of white Dust Bowl migrants to argue that Mexican, Filipino, Black, and Japanese farm workers had just as much right to citizenship and to land as displaced white Dust Bowl migrants. This is the work being done, for example, in Sonora Babb's, whose names are unknown. In Babb's work, her white Dust Bowl migrants realized the unfairness of the exploitation faced by the workers of color around them as they become racialized, as people start using terms like Okies and they start thinking about what that means, they start realizing and sympathizing with the Black and Filipino workers in the fields around them. And these white workers realized that their own best hope for bettering their condition would be to follow the leadership of workers of color who are positioned in the novel as far more experienced, resisting racism and exploitation. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath follows a path that's distinct from both of those options. The Grapes of Wrath responded to the ideological crisis by affirming the whiteness of Dust Bowl migrants and questioning the citizenship fitness of farm owners. So it sort of cast doubts on what kind of proper citizens or Americans that farm owners are. The novel's power comes in part from its affirmation of Dust Bowl migrants' whiteness and its contention that white Americans should be farmers, not farm workers. The novel relies on migrants' whiteness to indict those who deny them land. A renewal of American democracy, according to Steinbeck's novel, requires restoring white Dust Bowl migrant status as landowning citizen. What the novel does is unintentional. It underlying its racial logic is the sentiment that white citizens deserve land. But that's actually what I find so interesting about the novel, because Steinbeck didn't set out to write a novel in which people of color were outside of the nation state. He wasn't trying to justify their exploitation or exclude them from the rights in which he was writing about. What he set out to do was defend white Dust Bowl migrants in many ways, and the novel explicitly in many ways attempts sympathy for the non-white workers and brings them into the novel's pages in ways that weren't happening in works like Ruth Comfort Mitchell's novel. And yet, because it can't quite escape the common cultural constructions around race, citizenship, and land ownership of its period, it unintentionally relies on and reifies problematic understandings of race, citizenship, and land. So I actually end up seeing The Grapes of Wrath as a cautionary tale. And it ended up reshaping how I read contemporary environmental works, like Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma, for example. So let me take a step back to address 3 specific points about the novel directly. First, I want to provide some examples of how the novel establishes the Jodes' whiteness and their fitness for citizenship as a way of demonstrating their right to land. Second, I want to talk about the way the novel depicts the owners' unfitness for citizenship and American democracy as a way to show their unfitness as landowners. And finally, I want to talk about the implications of this strategy for the future of the people or man's self that Steinbeck envisions for California and ultimately for the American nation. I would argue that the construction of both the Jodes' whiteness and their citizenship is at the novel's core and at the core of the novel's depiction of proper land ownership. The Grapes of Wrath establishes the Jodes' Americanness as a way to establish their fitness for citizenship. Establishing fitness to citizenship is central to establishing land ownership. So the collective narrator explains, we ain't foreign, 7 generations back Americans, and beyond that, Irish, Scottish, English, German. One of our folks in the Revolution, and there was lots of our folks in the Civil War, both sides, American. So with roots in the American Revolution and Northern Europe before that, the novel assures readers of the Jodes' whiteness. As a family, the Jodes embody the nation's official history from Revolution to the novel's presence, including both sides of the Civil War. In telling this history, the novel emphasizes the connection between the character's past and the nation's past. And as a consequence of that, we read the Jodes' future as the nation's future. We see that continuing onward. As part of depicting the Jodes as iconic Americans, their past epitomizes the mythic past of the American West. The Jodes are descendants of pioneers, and their relationship to the land evokes this problematic pioneer mentality. The collective narration explains, Grandpa took up the land and he had to kill Indians and drive them away, and Pa was born here and he killed weeds and snakes. The suggestive equivalence of conquest, kill the Indians, and cultivation, kill weeds and snakes, fits with the frontier model of settlement. In US settler colonial and frontier traditions, white settlers claim ownership over the lands because they saw themselves as improving the landscape in contrast to the perceived negligence of Native Americans. The white family's labor was seen as making the land productive. So when the Jodes claim ownership of their homestead through improvement wrought by their hard work, they're participating in this problematic literary conventions of frontier narratives. In addition to establishing the Jodes' whiteness through their heritage and participation in the settling of the frontier and genocide of Native peoples, The Grapes of Wrath carefully constructs the Jodes' whiteness against blackness. References to blackness and to black slavery haunt the novel. There are no black characters in The Grapes of Wrath. Steinbeck, however, repeatedly references slavery and blackness through the owner's comparison of the white Dust Bowl migrants to blacks in the South, and because the Dust Bowl migrants are constantly joking and making derogatory references to blackness. The white Dust Bowl migrants themselves are repeatedly distinguishing themselves from black people and blackness as a way of establishing their whiteness and as a way of trying to acclaim a sense of citizenship and a belonging and a sort of right to land. So in the book's opening, Tom bonds with a white truck driver in order to catch a lift. The truck driver is not supposed to give rides, but Tom says to him, basically, give me a ride, or you're someone who, quote, any rich bastard could kick around. So he establishes this sort of class-based relationship that becomes cemented through their whiteness when the driver responds by telling this racist joke to Tom that really sticks with Tom, and he keeps trying to remember later in the novel to tell other people, but can't. In another scene, as Dust Bowl refugees gather around the campfire, they relate an incident about a white woman, quote, a lady back home, won't mention no names, who gives birth to a black child. And the racist anecdote turns on the migrants' inability to, quote, hunt out the presumably black father. These shared racial anecdotes not only link the migrants to one another through whiteness, but they communicate the Jodes' whiteness to the reader. So the references to blackness are actually central to how whiteness becomes legible in the text. And it separates the white migrants who are being positioned as black slaves by the white owners in California from black slaves by having the white migrants themselves make that distance happen. The other thing the novel does is treat white migrant farm workers as an entirely distinct category from all other farm workers. Immigrant farm workers, native farm workers, black farm workers, they're considered a totally different group. White migrant workers are repeatedly called outlanders and foreigners by better-off Californians who see them as less than white. Because the text gives all this previous detail of their actual Americanness, the accusation of foreignness rings really falsely, right? We've had pages and pages of how they're from the Revolution, they're both sides of the Civil War, so they're sort of established as not foreigners. But the same treatment is not given to non-white workers in the text. The narrator explains, quote, they imported slaves, although they did not call themselves slaves. Chinese, Japanese, Mexican, Filipinos. They live on rice and beans, the businessman said. They don't need much. They wouldn't know what to do with good wages. Why look how they live, why look what they eat, and if they get funny, deport them. So I want to be clear that we're not supposed to read this literally. The tone suggests to us that the owners are telling lies, right? That we're not supposed to believe that they wouldn't know what to do with good wages. But the narrative doesn't contradict the lies the way it does for the white migrants. And I think what's happening here is that Steinbeck's novel is suggesting that while those lies may work against foreigners, they will not work against white Americans. So that in the novel, the white owners are telling lies about everybody, but the non-white workers are positioned as sort of helpless to combat those lies in a way that the white workers Steinbeck does the work for them of combating those lies. It's notable that Steinbeck simply ignores the Mexican, Filipino, and Japanese workers who are also present in California's fields at this time, and also the native workers. There's one half Cherokee character, Jewel. Other than that, Steinbeck chose to make all of his farm workers white, just as he transforms the racial identity of a lot of the Mexican and Mexican-American strikers that he uses for models in *In Dubious Battle*.
Some have asserted that Steinbeck strategically highlighted worker whiteness, believing a national audience is just going to be more sympathetic to white workers. It seems equally likely that Steinbeck truly believed that white workers are going to successfully unionize and change how farm workers as a group were treated. This is an incorrect assumption. The historian Vicky Ruiz, among others, have done work showing that actually white workers were among, the Dust Bowl migrants were among the least likely to unionize, the least likely to go on strike. They really believed they needed to get residency and vote, whereas Mexican and Mexican-American workers had a family history of radicalism, often from the Mexican Revolution, and thus were actually far more likely to go on things like wildcat strikes. But what Steinbeck believes, and this comes out as well in his text, The Harvest Gypsies, is very common among white progressives of the era, including Carrie McWilliams. So it's not unusual that he would believe this. And his novel depicts these foreign workers as a non-threat to the agricultural industry. As the narrator explains, quote, the imported serfs were beaten and frightened and starved until some went home again, and some grew fierce and were killed or driven from the country, and the farms grew larger and the owners fewer. So the resistance these workers offered failed to stop or even slow industrial agricultural's growth. But in contrast, the white workers are positioned as this unstoppable threat to California's agricultural industry. Their exploitation becomes the grounds for a new American Revolution, right? In that famous passage, in the souls of the people, the grapes of wrath are filling and growing heavy, heavy for the vintage. Steinbeck constructs white workers' potential militancy against a false depiction of non-white worker passivity and complicity in labor exploitation. According to the novel, white workers then are entirely distinct from all previous workers and all other workers that are working alongside of them because they alone have this revolutionary potential as a result of their white citizenship, their proclivity to democracy, and their Jeffersonian heritage. So while it's doing this, it is also questioning the Americanness of California's farm owners. The novel depicts the owners as un-American in part because of their distance from actual agriculture. We're told now farming became an industry and the owners followed Rome, although they did not know it. And this statement's an accusation. Americans desire an emulation of Greek democracy, not the fall of a decadent and imperial Rome. Steinbeck represents California under the rule of its owners as ultimately outside of the US. For example, the government camp, where the Jodes are treated, quote unquote, like people, we're told here, quote, this here's the United States, not California. The lack of democracy and respect for white American citizens, such as the Jodes, marked the owners' oligarchy as unpatriotic. Additionally, the owners' relationship to nature sets them apart as less American than the Jodes, who have this continuing Jeffersonian relationship with the nature. The owners, quote, imported serf. They're moving towards a feudal relationship with the land. They, quote, farm on paper, and they forgot the land, the smell, the feel of it, and remembered only that they owned it, remembered only what they gained and lost by it. In contrast, the Jodes formally work their own land, and they aspire to own land again. In contrast to these un-American landowners and these foreign non-white workers, Steinbeck paints the Jodes and other white Dust Bowl migrants as Jeffersonian democracy's true heirs. The Jodes and other migrants are deeply connected to the land. Their community and their culture is built into the soil they till. Tenant farmers think, this land, this red land is us, and the flood years and the dust years and the drought years are us. When the Jodes abandon their homestead, they abandon a certain sense of themselves. Quote, how can we live without our past? How will we know it's us without our past? Their relationship to the earth connects them to their history, their memory, and their identity. Moreover, the novel repeatedly reminds readers that despite changes to their situation, their Jeffersonian qualities remain. So the Jodes always have these, and all the Dust Bowl migrants in the text have these inherent democratic proclivities that show up all the time. So when they're still on land before they're displaced, they have squatting circles through which the men participate in democracy, as several literary critics have commented about. And on the road, this democracy has changed, but it still exists. Steinbeck writes, gradually the techniques of world building became their techniques. Then leaders emerged, then laws were made, then codes came into being. Democracy is springing organically from these roadside campsites. Grapes of Wrath depicts the urge towards self-government as intrinsic, but threatened by this loss of land. So this development of a collective white class consciousness is central to the migrants' ability to change conditions in California and acquire land. At the novel's beginning, each character more or less looks after their own interests. Amah looks after the family's interests. And over time, the importance of the family breaks down. A passage that's often quoted, Ma states, "Used to be the family was first, ain't so now, it's anybody." And critics often talk about this as the move in the text from I to we, and the narrator explains, this is the thing to bomb, this is the beginning from I to we. And it's this new collectivity, this new we, that threatens to create a new society. But I think this prompts the question, who is the we in the novel? What is this new collective identity being formed? What does it mean to position this particular group of white migrants as the we that's going to bring America into fruition in this particular moment, right, in 1939? The migrants are displaced white US citizens treated like foreign non-white slaves rather than consenting free white labor. As such, they're prevented from realizing the privileges of their citizenship. At the same time, the owners who deny them those rights are marked as un-Americans, and the owners are depicted as having stolen California. And I would mention, they're not depicted as having stolen California from Mexico or from native peoples, but from the truly American settlers like the Jodes, and they transforming it into an un-American landscape. Thus, the white Dust Bowl migrants emerge not only as the novel's true Americans, but as California's great hope to restore itself to greatness. And Ma prophetically proclaims, "We're the people." So I would argue that completely unintentionally, Steinbeck's vision of the people or man's self doesn't include the Black, Asian, and Latinx farmers and farm workers that he's encountering when he's doing his research. The text repeatedly refers to white owners as potentially part of the citizens that the migrants are going to create. We're told, quote, "The quality of owning freezes you forever into I and cuts you off forever from the we." White owners had the opportunity to be part of this new American unity, but were cut off through their selfish individualism and fascist behavior. But the Asian, the Latinx, the Black migrant workers were never included in the growing we to begin with. The novel responds to the threat to Dust Bowl migrants' white citizenship by envisioning a collective white underclass that may reclaim this land. But in doing so, it capitalizes on a presumed slippage between the category of American and the category of white. And I want to ask you, how might The Grapes of Wrath read differently if Steinbeck consciously and explicitly included Black, Filipino, Mexican, or Japanese farmers and farm workers in the novel's we? Instead, it reaffirms the Jodes as the essence of the people, and it relies on this and reifies this racial logic of land ownership. So I want to end by saying, again, I think it's highly unlikely Steinbeck meant to create a racially exclusive narrative. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that that was not at all his intention, and that would probably be quite offended by the idea that that is the consequence. He was truly outraged at the injustice that such white Dust Bowl workers faced. So I think what we can learn from The Grapes of Wrath is the importance of consciously attending to race and nation in the understandings of land, and that when we ignore the racial implications of environmental thought, we do so at our own peril, or really at the peril of social and racial justice. Some social movements today, and I would argue that many critiques of industrial agriculture do this, unintentionally make the same ideologically mistakes. We need to ask ourselves, when we're not explicit about who we are including in the we, who are we excluding, and what is the consequence of that exclusion? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm also writing a book about Steinbeck, and one thing I'm discovering as I'm doing my research is that he's a deeply experimental writer. He often gets dismissed as a middle-brow writer, but I'm discovering that, you know, he's really experimental. In fact, at times he's downright weird, and a lot of these experiments are connected to his environmental thinking, and so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. And if Steinbeck's always had an uncomfortable position in the academy and amongst academics, then early reviews from prominent East Coast critics were largely responsible for that opinion. This is Edmund Wilson's review of Steinbeck's The Long Valley from 1940, a very dismissive view of the Californian Steinbeck. In many ways, though, Edmund Wilson was not wrong. Many of the stories in The Long Valley are about plants and animals, and indeed the collection includes one of American literature's most widely read stories about human-animal interactions, that is, The Red Pony. But what made these early readers critical, I think, makes Steinbeck particularly relevant and particularly timely as a thinker today. That is, in many of his stories and in his novels, he works actively to deconstruct the human as a central, dominant, normative category of analysis. He works at times to highlight the dangers of our speciesism, the dangers of our tendency to privilege our species above those of other species. He's a pioneer in many ways in considering humans as a species and exploring forms of agency, that is, forms of power beyond the human subject. So this is a huge subject in Steinbeck, and there's not a lot of time to talk about it today. So what I want to do is give you a brief introduction to three of these non-human states of consciousness, or perhaps awareness would be a better term. I'll look very briefly at the way that Steinbeck constructs them in a series of representative passages, and I call them the animal, the vegetable, and the mineral. And I'm going to be asking you to multitask a little bit today. I'm going to be showing some passages on the screen. I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to be reading them out, but you can all multitask, right? Isn't it just sort of inherent now? My children can do it, so I'm assuming that you'll be able to do that. Okay, animal. You're all, I'm sure, aware and remember the story of the red pony, or at least the first story in that collection, The Gift. It's the story of little Jody Tiflin. He's given the gift of a red pony, Gabilan. He carefully trains it under the disciplinary eye of his father. But Gabilan gets distemper after getting wet in the rain. Despite the promises of the farmhand, Billy Buck, to cure him, Gabilan gets worse and eventually heads out of the stable one night to die. And I want to focus on the final scene of The Gift, the scene where Jody follows the pony and confronts a group of buzzards who, here's Steinbeck and his red pony that he was given by his father as a boy. Jody heads out and confronts the group of buzzards who begin to feast on the dead animal. And here is the moment at the end of the story. It's an extremely jarring moment. It's an extremely violent moment at the end of what many people consider to be a children's book, in which Jody has a kind of hand-to-hand, face-to-face fight with a group of buzzards who eventually kind of vomit putrefaction in his eye and various other gruesome and grotesque moments. It's a scene in which it's as if Jody is entirely empty of interior human emotion. He becomes pure behavior. It's as if we're given the animal's point of view in a scene such as this. The categorical distinction between the human and the animal begins to collapse. Buzzards are a brotherhood. They have elbows, they have mouths, and they have a power of detached observation that brings Jody into view as the subject. And Jody himself likewise becomes an animal. He reverts to some primal instinct. On the one hand, the human subject, always so fragile, always so prone to shame throughout The Red Pony, performs a heroic act at this moment. Jody founds his humanity over a humiliated animal object. Yet the animal is also a threat to the human. This is a moment of equalization, a shared agency. If you focus on the highlighted line here, what is calm and fearless? Is it the red eyes looking into Jody's face? Are those calm and fearless? Or is it the face of Jody? Are we given the perspective here of the buzzard or of the human? Both of them are represented simultaneously as that question of agency is merged. This moment is continuous with the story as a whole. It's a story in which animals have interiority, animals have minds, emotions, intentions, yet humans seem merely conditioned reactors to environmental conditions, bundles of habits and behaviors. This may be a shockingly violent moment to us, described in compulsive detail, yet to Jody, it's continuous with the world in which he lives. It's not so weird, after all, to be having a fight with a group of buzzards. It's a world in which his father's violent discipline is equivalent to abuse. The point is that Jody sees the buzzard and his father at exactly the same level. They are similar threats to the integrity of his selfhood. It's another form of equalization between human and animal. The story ends with the father's rather ridiculous line to Jody, "The buzzards didn't kill the pony, don't you know that?" It's a misperception of what's going on. Jody is not responding rationally to an environmental situation. He may be driven by feeling, but it's not human feeling. It's more a condition of feeling animal. The father can't see how Jody would feel, but in a sense we can. The story prepares us to see from another perspective, one that pressures the species divide, to the extent that the human, as rational, integral, intentional, begins to break down. Vegetable, my second state of awareness that Steinbeck experiments with in his short stories. Here I'd like to focus on the first story in the Long Valley, the chrysanthemums, especially with regard to a very odd effect that the story seemed to have on its readers. Steinbeck writes to a friend about the chrysanthemums, "It is entirely different and is designed to strike without the reader's knowledge. I mean, he reads it casually, and after it is finished, feels that something profound has happened to him, although he does not know what nor how. It has had that effect on several people here." It's a story about a youngish but childless married couple. The story focuses on the wife, Elisa, who seems to be throwing all of her maternal energies into some very frantic gardening and weeding, especially her desire to grow huge white chrysanthemums. Then one day, an itinerant tinker rolls by, offering to fix some pots. And this leads to an extended conversation between Elisa and the tinker about the nature of gardening, one of Steinbeck's favorite subjects. This is the moment in which Elisa attempts to describe her reaction to close personal contact with the world of plants. It's as if she's attempting to define what can only be described as plant-mindedness. After all, we share much of our DNA with plants. Like us, plants breathe, they move, they sexually reproduce. She's attempting to explain and describe a plant-like point of view that's not quite expressible in human language. It's a state of being pure body, pure growth, a state of life not formed in opposition to animal death. It's a mindlessness, a state of being without risk. You can't do anything wrong, she says. It's a release from human values altogether. It's a state or a condition of passive receptivity. It becomes a state of pure bliss as she attempts to articulate it further later, an almost orgasmic state of existence. Again, her words are working at the very limits of consciousness, the very limits of what language can express. It's a moment of intense connection between human and animal, just as at this point in the story, her hand goes out towards the leg of the itinerant tinker, attempting like a root to stretch out horizontally and touch and connect with him. She drifts into plant-mindedness again when he leaves in this particular moment in which her head is thrown back. The scene comes vaguely into her eyes as if she seems to be like a plant, facing towards the sun, speaking in a mystical language of plants. That's a bright direction. There's a glowing there. And again, after getting ready to go out with her husband at the end of the story, she sits stiffly down, her eyes rarely blinking, gazing at a thin band of sunshine. Like a plant, she seems to be gaining her energy from the sun, virtually photosynthesizing as a character. So the weird impact of this story as I read it then is an attempt to answer a question, what is it like to be a plant? Through the imagination, Steinbeck is attempting, I think, to cross an interspecies barrier in a profound way to describe what it's like for a plant to be a plant. And we see this again at the very end of the story. Elisa strips herself down, scrubs her body, and then poses herself naked in the mirror. It's significant that she touches the water tank. Like a plant, she's attempting to root into the energy it absorbs and holds to find nutrition. It's also a self-consciously photographic scene. It's a posed nude. And we can think of it finally, we can think of this moment finally alongside the photographs of Steinbeck's contemporary and neighbor, Edward Weston, based in Carmel at the time, the Californian photographer. Here is a famous photograph, perhaps the most famous nude photograph from the 1930s, a photograph of Weston's wife, Caris Wilson. It's an attempt to represent a pure, non-sexual body. And Elisa is in a similar way posed as pure surface, a body as if it were pure vegetative existence. And Weston himself juxtaposes human bodies with the bodies of vegetables, not to sexualize the vegetable, as many viewers thought, who viewed his images, such as this one on the right, Pepper number 30, but he photographed them to reach a pure vegetative purity. He wrote of the visionary effect of his pepper, one of his many vegetable photographs. Quote, "It has no psychological attributes, no human emotions are aroused. This new pepper takes one beyond the world we know in the conscious mind." It's an entry, in other words, into the plant's point of view, an attempt shared by Weston and Steinbeck to become a vegetable, reaching into a pure universal sexuality, free from human desire, a passive being in pure form, a non-exploitative, ideal relationship to nature. Finally, mineral. There's not much time to say what I mean by this. And I'm not suggesting that Steinbeck is attempting to imagine what it's like to be a rock, but there is an attempt to imagine a planetary consciousness in Sea of Cortez, Steinbeck's experimental science textbook, co-authored with Ed Ricketts, that I think Mary Ellen is going to say some more words about, and Bill also mentioned. That is, it's an attempt to imagine the consciousness of the largest rock of all, that is the one on which we live, and it becomes, I think, Steinbeck's most explicitly environmentalist experimentation. There's much in Sea of Cortez that ties into my argument. For example, the attempt in Sea of Cortez to cross the interspecies divide, to give voice to the animal other through totalistic description, and hence to reach an awareness of humans as a species among species, interconnected into the whole. It's a book about life for sure, but also most profoundly it's a book about death, about extinction. In passages like this, we feel the vibrant interconnection of life as the possibility of differentiation between species collapses. Yet such descriptions are also part of a process in which the human is pushed out of the picture. These descriptions lead to a self-forgetting, a falling out of time. Quote, "Our minds and eyes went so deeply into it that size and identity were lost." Words themselves in Sea of Cortez evaporate through observation as they enter the pattern of the Gulf. Sea of Cortez is remarkable, as many others have noted, for its awareness of the Earth as a speck in the cosmos, for its shifts in scale, its encounter with deep time, which recognizes the inevitability of human extinction, the way that we are getting pushed out of the planet, just as the human is pushed out of descriptions such as this. Hence, the descriptions of species are always connected to death for Steinbeck. It's full of moments of killing, the preservation of specimens, the creation of still lives, a death that finally contains other possibilities, possibilities that are found in the Native Americans that Steinbeck encounters in the Gulf. They represent for him, in a somewhat idealized, romanticized, and somewhat problematic vision, they represent an absolute stillness. These are the possibilities of death found in his and Ricketts' theories of non-teleological thinking, recognizing simply what is, countering the teleological with the holistic, with a deep participation in the whole, a living into nature, which is captured in many of the shell photographs in Sea of Cortez. In the display along the left here that I hope you'll get a chance to look at later, you can see some of the shell photographs from Sea of Cortez. It's an attempt to conceptualize a condition in which, quote, the laws of thought must be the laws of things, unquote. Those are the words of the philosopher John Elof Bouden, very influential on Steinbeck and particularly Ricketts. It's an ultimate passivity, an egolessness, a falling out of narratives of progress altogether to live only in description. Of course, this is merely an idea, and it's one full of contradictions. The living death of the Native Americans that Steinbeck encounters is far from ideal, but it's still an attempt to theorize an ultimate post-humanness, an extinction of the person altogether that may be integral to our long-term survival, to become objects rather than subjects. It's something like, perhaps, what the writer Roy Scranton has called learning to die. That is, learning to let go of a certain way of life, learning to let go of identity, of success, progress, learning to shift toward an anti-capitalistic, non-teleological mindset, to survive in a carbon-fueled capitalism, speeding the earth toward climatic catastrophe. Thank you.
Hi, wow, this is so interesting. There's so much interesting stuff from each of these talks. It's fun to be here. So I'm going to talk about the Sea of Cortez. I've kind of gotten, you're kind of already oriented to it from both Bill and Gavin. So the Toto picture is a phrase that Ricketts used a lot to describe kind of a way of trying to comprehend species in this macrocosmic and microcosmic way at once, and when he focused on species, and then also as a kind of concept for integrating humanity and human thought and human interests like poetry, history, literature, and music with biology. So I'm going to talk about the Sea of Cortez, which is this co-created book by John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts, and you can see the subtitle says, A Leisurely Journal of Travel and Research with a scientific appendix on the marine animals of the Panamanic faunal province. So this Panamanic faunal province was something that Ricketts basically named. So this Sea of Cortez was published in 1941. It's about 600 pages long, and about the first 270 pages of it are a narrative of their expedition, an expedition that Steinbeck and Ricketts took to the Sea of Cortez. And then the remaining pages is a species catalog. So they went to collect species along the Gulf of California. This was an area that was unknown to Western science at the time. So nobody had really ever done any kind of inventory of what kind of species lived there. And Ricketts was an intertidal marine biologist, an amateur, so that was his particular interest. But there were a few other extenuating circumstances to this book. Steinbeck had just published The Grapes of Wrath in 1939, and it was a huge, huge success. It was a blockbuster bestseller. He got an audience of people reading it who didn't normally read books, but he was also equally reviled and criticized for his portrayal of people as animals, and he kind of was at his wit's end. His marriage was also breaking up. And he was declaring a moratorium, which didn't last very long, on writing fiction. And he said, I'm not writing fiction anymore. Science is the new thinking, and I'm going to write science. And this was not necessarily a new idea to him. As I think Bill pointed out, Steinbeck studied marine biology right here at Stanford. And then he and Ed Ricketts were great friends, and Ricketts' whole interest was as a marine biologist. Ricketts was interested in the fauna itself, and he was also interested in making some money. So they collected almost 600 specimens, even though there's only there's fewer of that in the species catalog. And as they collected, he sent them out to universities, mostly to labs that bought them from him, and he made about $12,000 from specimens that he sold. There's many more specimens that they collected that Ricketts sent out to professionals all over the world to identify when he did not know what the species were. And some of those sitting in museums today have still not been identified. So 10 years later, the book was reissued as the log from the Sea of Cortez. And in the middle one, sometimes the book cover has on it being the narrative portion of the Sea of Cortez, the report of the Steinbeck-Ricketts expedition in the Gulf of California. So in those 10 years, a lot happened. Ricketts most profoundly died. He was hit by a car. His car was hit by a train, and he ran afoul of. He was probably, well, it was an accident. Steinbeck's editor had never liked that specimen catalog, never wanted it to be attached to the narrative, and so he prevailed on Steinbeck, let's take that off of the book and reissue it, and we'll give it another chance in the marketplace. So Steinbeck went along with that, and they republished it, and now this is basically the book that you buy when you go to the bookstore. It's the log from the Sea of Cortez, and then you see in the orange book cover that Steinbeck wrote an appreciation of his friend Ed Ricketts upon his death that's now included as kind of an afterword to the book. So my point today is that in looking to define and inquire and query what this Toto picture might be, the really useful part of what Steinbeck and Ricketts did together is the species list, which is, you can still get it, but it's not normally sent out as part of what they did together. So I'll go back to that, why I think that. So who was Ed Ricketts? This is Ed Ricketts bent over there in Alaska collecting, and here he is. I think that one is off the coast of Carmel. Here he is with a giant squid. This picture was taken by Ralph Bushbaum, who is actually a famous invertebrate zoologist, whose daughter is Vicki Pierce, who's also a famous invertebrate zoologist. And this picture, I went and heard Gavin, or maybe you showed it to me. I saw Gavin call this kind of an American romantic image, and I think there is something about Ed Ricketts that even when he was alive, he was very charismatic and people adored him, and they still do. He has quite a following. There are Facebook pages dedicated to Ed Ricketts. There's scores of documentaries made about Ed Ricketts. It would seem people who love Ed Ricketts really want to make films. And there are those who don't like Ricketts' relationship with Steinbeck all that much. So as Bill pointed out, Steinbeck modeled some characters in some of his novels on Ricketts, and these are kind of wise man characters, kind of louche characters, if that's the right way you say that word. And some of the real devotees of Ricketts don't like that at all. They think he was a very serious scientist, and that is not a good way to portray Ed Ricketts. This is the name of a bar you can go to right now in North Beach called Doc Ricketts. I think this illustration is a little funny because he certainly never did any deep sea diving. He bent over in the tide pools. But a couple of lines down in this About Our bar, the owners say, in his lab, night after night, he hosted writers, artists, scientists, philosophers, musicians, and locals. And this is the spirit of Ed Ricketts, like everybody into the party, like let's all talk, and he was a very open source kind of guy, and everybody felt comfortable with him and not judged, and he was interested in lots of everything. But he made a living selling specimens, and this is a picture of a 1929 catalog of specimens for sale from the Pacific Biological Laboratories. And here's just a random page. It's not randomly organized at all, but I chose this randomly because I liked the way the pictures looked. But he organized his catalog by phylogeny. So phylogeny is body type. And after Darwin made his big earth-shattering observations about how life forms come into being, generations of scientists set to understanding how new life forms come into being. And you can trace an evolutionary pattern of new life forms by their morphologies or body shapes. And this still works today to a certain extent, though not completely. But all the kind of tide pool guides and any kind of introduction you might want to tide pool creatures at this time was laid out this way by phylogeny. And when you actually go into a tide pool to look at creatures there, that phylogeny isn't going to do you very much good to orient you to what you're looking at, not whatsoever. Those different body forms also represent very, very vastly different places along their lineages, and they're found in all sorts of different places. So this is a leather star that's off, I think I took this picture off the coast of Half Moon Bay. These are actual invertebrates. This is a scallop. This picture, Ed Ricketts would have liked this because it's covered with all sorts of other creatures, kind of illustrating that community idea that Ali had introduced to Ricketts. This is an octopus. Sometimes you can see red octopuses that are small off the coast right here. And thank you to Matt James in the back for telling me what this is. It's a ctenophore. So these are what you find in the tide pools are invertebrates. And the way that the ecology of the tide pool works is indeed a microcosm of the way other ecosystems work. Terrestrial life forms. All life forms do have a common ancestor, as Gavin alluded to, and all of them issue forth from the oceans. All of other terrestrial landforms came marching up from the water. And all of the lineages that we can trace back can still be found in the tide pool. You can see every phylogeny staring you in the face, as one biologist put it to me about the tide pool. So when 1939, when Steinbeck published The Grapes of Wrath, Ricketts published his own magnum opus, Between Pacific Tides. Stanford University Press published it. Took them a long time to publish it because he did something that was indeed revolutionary. And instead of presenting the tide pool by phylogeny, he presented tide pool organisms by where they live. So it's an ecological concept that happens to be very practical. And if you get into tide pooling, people will still tell you, go get this book by Ed Ricketts, it's really wonderful. So, it was written a long time ago, but it has a lot of very basic information in it, and it's very enjoyable to read it. So the expedition to the Sea of Cortez, these are some pictures from that. That's Carol Steinbeck, I guess, up on the right there, who is Steinbeck's wife. They're having a very tough time during this 6-week voyage, and there's Steinbeck with the captain of the boat, Tony Berry, and then the whole gang that took the expedition. Carol was the only woman. So the book, Tony Berry kept a log from the journey, the 6 weeks, and so did Ed Ricketts. And you can actually read Ed Ricketts' version of what they did in this book, Breaking Through Essays, Journals, and Travelogues of Ed Ricketts, and that Catherine Roger edited. And I really like to read Ricketts' take. I mean, he's the one telling the story as it's happening. So then Steinbeck took Ricketts' tale and he retold it in his own Steinbeck way. This is the Western Flyer itself. These pictures are from like about a year or two ago, and this boat has been under restoration for a long time. And like Ed Ricketts, it also has its own charisma that it's exerting over the years. And here is the pathway that they took. So I'm going to read you a short couple of little excerpts just to kind of give you a sense of why so many people, well, the point of my story here is that generations of marine biologists have fallen in love with this book, and they have used it as a Bible and an inspiration to go to the Sea of Cortez to explore it for themselves. And they have also used it to resurvey the Sea of Cortez and to verify and compare what they find there with what Steinbeck and Ricketts found there. And why would so many marine biologists love this book? Our own interests, this is from Steinbeck, our own interests lay in relationship in relationships of animal to animal. It seems apparent that species are only commas in a sentence, that each species is at once the point and the base of a pyramid, that all life is relational. One merges into another, groups melt into ecological groups, until the time when what we know as life meets and enters what we think of as non-life. Barnacle and rock, rock and earth, earth and tree, tree and rain and air. And then he goes on, and it is a strange thing that most of the feeling we call religious, most of the mystical outcrying, which is one of the most prized and used and desired reactions of our species, is really the understanding and the attempt to say that man is related to the whole thing, related inextricably to all reality known and unknowable. So just in this one paragraph, and there's many paragraphs like this in this book, all of these huge themes are grappled with and integrated. So, and a lot of this is very, very relevant today and has been relevant for decades. So this understanding of life's relation, both phylogenetically through the evolutionary history of how life forms have come into being, and then ecologically how species interact with each other and in the environment. And then Ricketts' words from his travelogue, basically, this little trip of ours was becoming a thing and a dual thing, with collecting and eating and sleeping merging with the thinking, speculating activity. And I think this really kind of interestingly echoes some of what Gavin was saying about this merging, this oneness that both of them are searching for ways of expressing and ways of experiencing. And as Steinbeck said, we wanted to see everything our eyes would accommodate, to think what we could, and out of our seeing and thinking, to build some kind of structure in modeled imitation of the observed reality. So that modeled imitation of the observed reality is what the species list gives us actually access to today most impactfully. So here is Carol and John Steinbeck. This is a really wonderful book that Susan Schillinglaw wrote. The Toto picture that this book comprehends left out a few big things. One is Carol Steinbeck is not mentioned in it at all. And you know, we can blame him for that, and certainly many people have, but his marriage was breaking up, and one can imagine, any writer knows you have to leave out some big things if you're going to get a coherent narrative written. And maybe it was impossible for him to incorporate writing about her without it sort of tanking the narrative. On the other hand, when you read Ricketts, he talks about Carol very organically and very easily and very sympathetically. She gets seasick, she tidies up the boat, she goes out for her adventures, and there's a scene where she's actually having a nightmare and she's calling out in her sleep, but she's still asleep, and Ricketts goes and he puts his hand on her head and tries to calm her and wonders if he was effective. And here's another thing. I just got this off the internet. This is the friars and the native indigenous people of Mexico, and when the colonial forces came in and took over. So, as Gavin alluded to, this living death that Ricketts and Steinbeck both kind of observed in the Indians. They didn't really ever inquire really what was the situation of these Indians that they were encountering, and they, in a sense, they didn't know at all where they were. They didn't even ask where they were. It's kind of a curious point that although they have this big ambition to get the Toto picture, they never actually sort of grappled with the real location of who lived here for how long, what had happened to those people, what was the impacts between the people on the landscape and the biodiversity on the landscape, how had that changed over time? These are questions we know we have to ask today to understand what's going on here. But nobody was thinking in those terms at all in those days. So here are a couple of slides of some scientists who were deeply inspired by Ricketts, and this is an illustration of change over time. There's Rick Brusca in 1971, the young picture, and then there he is more recently with his wife Wendy Moore, who's an entomologist. And Rick Brusca and another scientist went to go back, very much inspired by Ricketts and Steinbeck and their species list, but to really go and do comprehensive, very scientifically rigorous surveying and inventorying of the Gulf of California. So they also, Rick Brusca has meticulously cataloged all of Ricketts specimens, and he's done a lot to try to get them all into the same place. Most of them are in the Smithsonian. And then he has much more comprehensively surveyed the Gulf of California. But for many years, for several decades, that species list of Ricketts was the guide to the fauna of the Gulf of California. And this, just for, if there's any Ed heads in the audience, you will appreciate this picture of Joel Hedgepeth there with Rick Brusca. And Joel Hedgepeth has the plaid tie, a very passionate keeper of the Ricketts flame. Then in 2004, this is another very significant expedition set forth by William Gilley, who's married to Susan Schillinglaw, to resurvey the Sea of Cortez, and to set out, not necessarily in the same way of Brusca, to be this really big drill down, but to set up transects that could be revisited and revisited and revisited. So now we get into how we're starting to really understand how to comprehend what a place is, that we can't just take one snapshot of it in time and expect that that expresses what it is. The only way to really understand what a place is to observe it over time. So this is a screenshot from an exhibit at the Arizona Museum of Natural History that highlighted this experience of this big re-expedition in the footsteps or whatever of Steinbeck and Ricketts. And that inset is Bill Gilley, I think. And then this is Rafe Agron. So Rafe Agron was among the biologists on that trip, and he was an outlier biologist, kind of modeling himself in the mold of Ed Ricketts. He had a PhD, and he had a real science job, but he was very restless about the way science does its business. He was very much a proponent of community-based science or citizen science, and in saying the local knowledge and the history of place and different kinds of perspectives are critical to understanding what's going on anywhere. And Rafe, sadly, was hit by a car himself riding his bicycle to work a couple of years ago. So change over time. I'm just going to do two of the sites where Ricketts and Steinbeck collected. This is Cabo San Lucas, actually a little bit later than they collected, but there's basically was nothing there. And this is the 2016 spring break in Cabo San Lucas. So this is a place where nature has pretty much been decimated and built over. By contrast, this is from Cabo San Pulmo, which has been protected as a marine protected area and still has this incredible vibrant biodiversity. And this is a kind of place that inspires people. Jacques Cousteau famously called this the aquarium of the world. But it is not without its bigger troubles. This is a vaquita. This is just a couple of days ago in the New York Times, where some scientists are calling this vaquita extinct. There's still a few individuals left. So they're saying, if you want to save this vaquita, we've got to collect those individuals and captive breed them. Now, this is where we're at, right? I was just at a conference this weekend about animals, wild animals all over the world. So hearing from researchers all over the world about what's happening to wild animals. Well, they're going away, they're disappearing. And extinction is one thing when you reach the end of that lineage and that species is never to come again, and that is we are in a sixth extinction with plants and animals leaving at a rate and magnitude that took out the dinosaurs. But arguably worse is this vast reduction in the bodies of plants and animals that we're experiencing, and it's not abating, and it is definitely the direct result of globalization. So a famous ecologist called some animals walking dead when there's only a few of them left that may not get the extinction check mark, but they no longer have an ecological function. And so this vaquita is essentially swimming dead, and even if they rear it in captivity and can bring its numbers back up, whether it can actually be ecologically relevant again within the ecosystem in which it evolved, it is a question mark. So today, how do we monitor and evaluate and get our total picture? Well, here's the good news, is that we have this incredible ways of understanding and grappling with many different levels of what's going on in a place. So this is a screenshot from a database you can query, and it's really pretty fun. They've got a bunch of stories of different things in the Gulf on this database, and this is a highly, highly professional monitoring done by the Scripps Oceanographic Institute. Now, Steinbeck and Ricketts were in the tide pools, and there was maybe some snorkeling going on, but by and large, they were just leaning down and seeing what they could see and picking things up. And these people do deep sea diving, so it is a much more intensive monitoring of what's going on there. If you want to help, you can by using iNaturalist the next time you go to the Sea of Cortez. So iNaturalist is an app and a database where you put it on your phone essentially, or you can just take a picture with and get a GPS reading of your observation. So this is a screenshot of 1,044 observations people have made of a variety of species in the Gulf of California. And here is a map of those identifications. So all those little blobs represent densities of observations of species. Now, iNaturalist got started just a couple of years ago, and it has amassed more than 3 million observations of biodiversity around the world. The database that is really the mother of this kind of database is about birds, called eBird, and eBird has amassed more than 300 million observations of birds. So this is what we want for the rest of the taxa, is to get up to the 300 million mark, because that's when you can really start making assessments about what's really going on between these ecological interactions. This is a photograph of a specimen of a sea star, and I should have said earlier those invertebrate photographs that were so beautiful, and this one were all taken by Susan Middleton, who's an amazing photographer. All of that baseline data collection of iNaturalist and the data Mars would not make as much sense to us today if we did not have the baseline specimens that Ricketts and Steinbeck collected. They form a baseline of comparison of what is still there, what isn't still there. We can test the DNA of species we collect today and compare it to the same species when they collected. And so one wonderful thing that has happened in the interim of these years is that where Steinbeck and Ricketts saw the total picture and kind of approached it in a spatial way, of seeing like what are the species across a certain kind of territory, a certain kind of space. This kind of technology and this kind of awareness has brought us to a temporal dimension. So we are putting the spatial and temporal dimensions together to truly get a total picture of what's happening. And when you get enough of these data, you can start to make predictions about extinctions and see them happening before they happen. This is what we want, and this is what we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Ellen. Your last slide was of a heliaster, and because I'm married to a marine biologist, I can go to the Sea of Cortez, and I spent a delightful month, actually with Stanford students, poking into the stomachs of heliasters to see what they eat. So for an English professor, it was a lot of fun. So that's my scientific study. The stomachs of heliasters. But I am to be cleanup person and also to ask the question, try to integrate my responses to all these talks, and also to ask the question, why did someone growing up in Salinas, California end up writing The Red Pony, The Grapes of Wrath, and Sea of Cortez? What's the basis of this environmental vision? And I was trying to, I just put together some slides to try to imagine how to respond given what I thought everybody might say, which is kind of a hard task. But luckily, Bill Souder accommodated me in talking about valleys. But living in place is, first of all, to sort of deeply participate in where you live. And I think Steinbeck did that. I turned to Eudora Welty, who wrote a great essay about place and the role of place in fiction. And she tries to kind of get at what it means to live in place and why writers are affected by place. Place is where the writer has roots. Place is where he stands and his experience out of which he writes. It provides the base of reference in his work, the point of view. And considering what Gavin said, that rootedness can take many forms. But it's also the name, the identified, the concrete, the local, and the feelings bound up in place. And I think Steinbeck, in this kind of holistic sense of place, manages to capture all of those sensibilities. Early on, this was his grandfather, his paternal grandfather, and early on he said something that I think helps us see the meaning of place for Steinbeck. My country is different from the west of the world, he said. It seems to be one of those pregnant places from which come wonders. And again, thinking about what Gavin says, to think of the earth as pregnant is, you know, it's not only giving birth, but it's also we're rooted in it. I was born to it, and my father was. Now that's a lie. His father was not born to it. His father was born in Florida. But in order to kind of get these roots deeper, these California roots established, he has to lie about his paternity in order to kind of have the credentials, the rootedness to write about place. Our bodies came from this soil, our bones came from the limestone of our own mountains, and our blood is distilled from the juices of this earth. So there's your mineral, Gavin. I tell you now, my country, 100 miles long and about 50 wide, is unique in this world. But I mean, that sensibility, you know, really did inform everything he wrote about California. And if you think about his California fiction, of the 1930s, how many titles refer to places? Tortilla Flat, Cannery Row, which was written in the 40s, but East of Eden, written later. But the California fiction is about the Long Valley, Pastures of Heaven, is about places that he knew. Now, I put in this picture again because I knew that Gavin was going to talk about humans as vegetables. But looking at place, growing up in the teens and 20s in California, this is what you would have seen. The short-handled hoe was not banned in California until 1973. So until then, workers were bent over the crops. They look like they're returning to the earth. So to see the human as vegetative would have been sort of, that's the vision you would have seen, not upright humans, but bent over humans. And they literally did have their hands in the soil. As Gavin was talking also, I was struck by the fact that the chrysanthemums, which is one of Steinbeck's best stories, starts out with Eliza with scissors clipping the buds. She's on the top, she's using a machine, and then she returns to the soil with her hand, the planter's hands that would really engage her. She almost goes from the surface to the soil in the course of that story. So I think that, you know, a sense of place and characters in place is one of the reasons that people come back to Steinbeck again and again. He knew that writing about the land and trying to kind of identify his relationship with the land did not put him, he did not feel that it would make him seem an experimental or modernist writer. But I think his appreciation for place is seen in so many of his very fine sentences, which are, you know, concrete, very palpable. So sense of place is really the colors of grasses, the green, the tawny, the straw-colored, how many colors he has for the grasses of California. When he was writing The Grapes of Wrath, the first thing his wife said to him was, stay with the detail. You've got to stay with the detail. And that's really what it is. It's a slow book because this detail slowly unfolds as one reads the book. And I think to think about Steinbeck and the environment and his environmental vision, you have to think about that Observation. Observation was important to Ricketts. It's important in the Sea of Cortez. It's important in, grapes. It's important in everything he wrote, that the specificity of his observations. Those catalogs in Sea of Cortez are really about closely observing, all the specimens that he and Ricketts and Carroll discover. Oh, that quote disappeared, but what it says, I don't know where it went, the computer swallowed it. But what he says is, I've never been a joiner. I've never joined anything other than the Boy Scouts and the Episcopal choir. And I think that detachment is something that allowed Steinbeck to be the observer. I think it's really important to kind of the visions that Gavin was talking about, that Mary Ellen was talking about in terms of how you see clearly, you detach almost as a non-human observer, and it allows you to become something other than, just an ego or a conscious ego observing something. And so his role as a detached writer, I think, helped him in descriptions of place. So I was trying to kind of break down the sense of place and what it means to get at this whole sense of Steinbeck's environmentalism. And if place is the texture, what we see in place, I think place and character is equally important. Again, as Eudora Welty said, place has a good do with making the characters real, that is, themselves, and keeping them so. The moves we make in the place we live has to signify our intent and meaning. And I think, Val, this is what you were getting at when you talked about Steinbeck's characters and identifying with the characters. And so many readers, I think, see the characters as living in place. Ed Ricketts and Doc, yes, he was in Doc in the book and Ed in real life. But I think the way he's seen in terms of Cannery Row and the tide pools around Cannery Row define, we want tourists go to Cannery Row looking for Ricketts or the spirit of Ricketts. They want to find the actual thing itself because he's so closely identified with those places. So walked on the beach beyond the lighthouse, the waves splashed white beside him and sometimes basted his ankles. The sandpiper ran ahead of him as though on little wheels. The golden afternoon moved on toward China, and on the horizon's edge, a lumber schooner balanced. I mean, that finely wrought sense of place makes us see characters in light of place. And one thing Steinbeck says, and I think this also helps us appreciate how he's writing these visions of environmental holism, which include place, people, animals, plants. He says, when he's writing Travels with Charlie, as always, my primary interest will be people, but against their proper background, mostly country people. And I should like to record them. I'll take my little Stussy tape recorder. That will be to make notes on accents, tempo of speech, the overtones you only get in the human voice. But that you can't understand humans unless you understand where they came from. So I think Steinbeck's Ecology is about that. It's also about history. I was struck by Sarah's very interesting comments about the history of whiteness in the Grapes of Wrath, which has been problematic for many readers. Why does Steinbeck write a novel that's supposedly historically accurate about Oklahoma migrants and completely leave out any reference to the diversity of California laborers? But another explanation is also that Steinbeck was very much aware of history and how what California's history was. And California's history, as he says in American Americans, was a history of absolute intolerance of all the migrant workers that had been in California in the previous generation, starting in the 1850s with Chinese, and then Japanese, and then Filipinos, and so Mexican workers. And then you have this new wave of migrants, white migrants. And what are you going to do now? And it's almost like throwing down the gauntlet for the growers and shippers. How are you going to ship these people back to Oklahoma? They're Americans. So that insistence on their Americanness and that they are Oklahomans is also saying you actually can't deport Americans as you can Chinese and Filipinos and Japanese as we did. And I think obviously he waited a long time before he wrote the history of California in the book he wanted to write, the sort of magnum opus, East of Eden, where he wanted to make my country as great in the literature world as any place in existence. And again, I was kind of struck by what Gavin said about mineral, because this is actually the ranch, what he called old starvation acres. And East of Eden, the original intention was to organize the book around water, looking for water. And Sam Hamilton's always looking for water, and the Salinas River is an underground river. So there is a kind of, there's a kind of depth and geological time in East of Eden that he's trying to get at. He didn't. He kind of abandoned the organizational principle through the book. And the ranch was a relative, and when Sam, left it, he plunged a knife into the darling. So this way of understanding what ecology means for Steinbeck and ecological holism finally, and I think this is the reason that there are certain passages throughout Steinbeck that suggest that he wants to contain the whole and somehow grasp the whole and have a vision of place that includes not just texture, not just characters living in place, not historical resonance in place, but also something larger that I think each speaker has alluded to in various ways. Val in his appreciation for the larger vision, Bill in the sense of valleys and what that means, Gavin in animal, vegetable, mineral, and Mary Ellen in her appreciation for Sea of Cortez and how the total picture. But one thing he said I think we should also always keep in mind when reading Steinbeck, and this is in that notebook right there that is spread out for you to view. Each figure is a population, and the stones, the trees, the muscled mountains are the world. But not the world apart from man, the world and man, the one inseparable unit, man and his environment. Why they should ever been understood as being separate, I do not know. Now, this is what got Steinbeck in trouble throughout the 30s, that he didn't see humans as dominating and controlling nature as everyone else wanted to, but humans were another species. And therefore, it seemed like he was degrading humans. And this, of course, comes to fruition in Sea of Cortez, as Mary Ellen told you. Steinbeck and Ricketts, the one thing I want to leave you with is this quote from Sea of Cortez. Why do we so dread to think of our species as a species? Can it be we are afraid of what we may find, that human self-love would suffer too much and the image of God might prove to be a mask? I mean, it's a question that reverberates throughout the Sea of Cortez, but kind of comes to a culmination at the end. Unless you think this environmental vision ended when Steinbeck left California and left Ricketts' influence, it didn't. He continued to think of humans as species, and he continued to sort of play with the ideas that fascinated Ricketts throughout his career: survivability, wave shock, the things, eating, reproducing, surviving, that animals had to contend with every day. So as he's writing his very last novel, he says, can't it be argued at last that if the first monocellular blob of life had found continuing security, no other form of life would have evolved? For we are the versatile and complicated products not of love and security, but of pain and danger and fear. It was not comfort that made us, but unease and endless insecurity. I love that passage. And I think it's sort of politically, socially, and environmentally relevant today. So I was trying to weave together commentary or my response to the papers, as well as sort of structuring Steinbeck's environmental vision in 10 minutes, so I hope I did that. Anyway, thank you very much. Now for one.